Hello everyone and welcome to another recorded lecture of BIO1 online. Today we'll be discussing chapter 2, which is on the chemistry of life. So in this picture, we see some penguins standing on a floating sheet of ice. And the penguins, the ice, and the water, and even the air are all forms of matter. So the matter that makes up every object on this planet consists of one or more elements that are organized into atoms and molecules. So we said last time that life is organized, right? That's one of the qualifications to be living. You must be organized. And there's a hierarchy of organization that begins at the chemical level. So that's what we'll talk about today. It's what makes up human beings, what makes up all living things. And let's start from the basics. Let's start from the smallest, most simple level, which is the chemical level, molecules and atoms. So chemistry is the scientific study of matter and their interactions. And life is very fragile, right? Life depends on the proper functioning of millions of chemical reactions and trillions of cells at every second. So for a cell to function properly, the chemistry inside of the cell has to be working properly. So we said chemistry is the scientific study of matter, and matter refers to anything that has mass and occupies space. So matter exists in four states: solids, liquids, gases, and plasma. The book doesn't really talk about plasma. You see those in stars, for example, but on this next slide, you see that a solid has the lowest state of energy and the molecules are very close together. Molecules in a liquid have a little more energy and they flow around each other a lot more easily. So they could take on any shape of their container. A gas has tons of energy. So these molecules are always moving around at great speeds, flying around, and they don't have a lot of force between these molecules. So it's increasing energy. And then again, plasma, you see at very high temperatures, like in stars. So we said all matter, whether it's alive or not alive, is composed of elements. An element is something that can't be broken down into another substance by ordinary chemical means. It's a pure substance. That's what an element is. And on planet Earth, we have 92 naturally occurring elements. So if you were to look all around Earth, you would see 92 different substances that can't be broken down. So carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, these are all elements. And 6 elements make up 95% of the body weight of organisms. So these are called bulk elements because they make up the bulk of living things. And you can remember this acronym CHNOPS for carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. There's also a lot of other elements called trace elements, like iron and zinc. We need very, very small amounts of those. But the biggest elements that we require are these 6. Not listed here is sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium, which we also need as well. But again, these are the big 6 that you should know. So an atom. What is an atom? It's the smallest part of an element. And an atom and an element have the same name. So for example, a carbon atom is the smallest part of the element carbon. Right, so the element of carbon is made up of carbon atoms. The element oxygen is made up of oxygen atoms. And each atom is composed of subatomic particles. So within every atom, you're going to see protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons have a positive charge. You can remember P for positive. Neutrons are neutral. They have no charge. Electrons are negatively charged. And they have very, 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 very low mass. You could almost think of them as being very transient, because they're always moving very fast. Protons and neutrons are located in the center of an atom called the nucleus. So the nucleus of an atom contains protons and neutrons. We'll talk about a different kind of nucleus of a cell that contains DNA. That's a different type of nucleus. So a cell's nucleus has DNA. We're talking about an atom now. It's not alive. Atoms, again, make up all matter. The nucleus of an atom has protons and neutrons. And electrons orbit the nucleus, meaning they go around and around and around. They travel in circles called orbitals. So this is a summary of what we spoke about so far, whereas protons and neutrons both have an atomic mass unit. It's an arbitrary unit of 1. Electrons don't even have any mass. Their mass is negligible. So they're essentially weightless compared to protons and neutrons. Some fun facts: there are more atoms in a single grain of sand than grains of sand on Earth. So that is quite a mind-bending fact, right? If you think about all the deserts in the world, that's a lot of sand. But if you just took one grain of sand, there are more atoms in that one little grain of sand. And suppose that this is Gillette Stadium. Suppose that this is one atom. This marble, if I put the marble directly in the center of the field, that would represent the nucleus. I want to illustrate how far away the electrons are from the nucleus. So my little marble is the nucleus. That would go in the center of the field. The electrons would be in the bleachers, circling, which means that everything in the stadium is essentially just empty space. So again, this is a little trippy, right? Because what I'm saying is everything is made up of atoms. Everything that you see and touch and feel is made up of atoms. But atoms are actually mostly empty space, right? The nucleus of an atom is in the center, but the electrons are so far away that most of it is empty space. And again, it turns out that most of the world around us is empty space, but we have the illusion of solids and liquids that we can visualize. A quick way to think about this, without going into too much detail, is imagine a fan moving really, really fast. If a fan moves really fast, you could almost throw a ball at it and it would bounce off. Because it's moving so fast, it almost acts like a solid. But if you shut the fan off and you threw a ball at it, it would probably go right through the spaces, right? Because it's mostly space. A fan is just a couple of spokes, but mostly space. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that when something moves very, very fast, it can almost act like a solid. And that's why I could knock on my desk, which is just made of atoms, mostly empty space, but it still acts like a solid. So each element has a unique chemical symbol. For example, H is hydrogen, Na is sodium, C is carbon. And the atomic number, each element has a unique atomic number, which is the number of protons in the nucleus. So hydrogen, for example, is the simplest. It has an atomic number of 1. Helium has an atomic number of 2. It's just the number of protons in each atom of an element. Another term you should know is called the mass number. And an atom's mass number is the total number of protons plus neutrons. And because protons and neutrons have the same mass, you could subtract the atomic number from the mass number to get the number of neutrons in the atom. Sometimes you'll see this term atomic mass instead of mass number. For this class, I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. The atomic mass might not be a whole number because it takes into account other forms of the element found on this planet. So like an average mass, where mass number is just how many neutrons and protons are there in the nucleus. So for example, in helium, the mass number is 4. The atomic number is 2. So how many neutrons does helium have? Right, the answer is 2 neutrons. That's 2 neutrons, 2 protons, which gives the mass number of 4. An isotope. An isotope is something that has the same number of protons, but a different number of neutrons. So all atoms of an element have the same number of protons, but not necessarily the same number of neutrons. Right? So an isotope is any of these different forms of a single element, right? That have different mass numbers. So the atomic mass of an atom refers to the average mass for all isotopes of that atom, like I mentioned before. So the atomic mass of carbon is 12.01. Because carbon 12 is most abundant, meaning the mass number is 12. It has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But there are other forms of carbon as well. There's something called carbon 13, which instead of 6 neutrons, it has 7 neutrons. But it's still considered carbon because it has 6 protons. There's also carbon 14. So these are radioactive. So isotopes that are unstable may be radioactive. A radioisotope is a radioactive isotope that releases energy as it decays. So if you have a radioactive atom, it's unstable. It basically breaks down into smaller parts because it's unstable. And as it does, it releases energy. And this energy can be harmful or it can be used to help. For example, a PET scan, positron emission tomography, can use radioactive glucose to label the thyroid. So for example, the thyroid is a metabolic center, right? So it's always metabolizing. And you can see how well the tissue is uptaking glucose to see how efficient it's metabolizing. So you can visualize this radio-labeled glucose using a PET scan. And the different colors indicate how healthy the cells are. So again, what you're doing is you're taking a special glucose molecule and injecting it in the body, and glucose breaks down. This form of glucose is unstable. So it breaks down and it releases energy as it breaks down. And again, the more a cell will take up the glucose, the more energy can be released, and that can be detected in a photograph. Right? Same idea for an MRI. We can use contrast in an MRI to help visualize for the brain. Also, we can treat cancers of the brain. So like some glioblastomas can be treated with high levels of radiation that are targeted toward the tumor site. Also, you might notice, so like, and here, this can be organic fruit, and this is non-organic fruit. So sometimes you might have noticed that organic fruit doesn't last as long. And that's because most of our food that's non-organic is irradiated, what means it's exposed to high levels of radiation right after it's picked and before it goes to the supermarket. So any bacteria and fungi could be killed because normally that would lead to the decomposition of the fruit a lot faster. So organic foods are not irradiated, and therefore they don't last as long because their fungi and bacteria naturally, just decompose the fruit. Note that there's no harm in radiation when you're eating it after it's irradiated, right? The radiation doesn't stay inside of the fruit. So here is a quick rapid response question. So please tell me, what is the mass number and atomic mass? What is the atomic number? And what is the symbol? So pause here. So the mass number is 12. The atomic mass is 12.01. The atomic number, which is the number of protons, is 6. And the atomic symbol is C for carbon. So the periodic table of elements displays all the known elements in a very organized fashion. And the rows are called periods. The columns are called groups. In each period, elements are arranged in increasing atomic number, so they get larger and larger as you go from left to right. And atoms within the same group share the same chemical characteristics. So again, this periodic table was organized beautifully and very methodically. So all the elements, I should say, in this column over here are called noble gases because they're so stable, they're very happy, and they're all gases. These two groups over here are both types of metals. They're all organized by metal. So again, you have different themes going on within the periodic table. All atoms shown in this table are not charged. Okay, what that means is if the atomic number, let's just take carbon, for example. The atomic number is 6, meaning it has 6 protons. Carbon is neutral, right? that means that if it has 6 protons, that's plus 6, it has to have 6 electrons to balance it. So the number of protons equals the number of electrons for a neutral atom. That's important. So here's just a portion of the periodic table. So let's talk about electrons and energy. This could get a little tricky, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. It's a biology class, after all, not a chemistry class. But electrons determine the chemical behavior of atoms, and electrons each have energy due to their distance from the nucleus. So electrons are constantly in motion. That means it's impossible to determine the exact location of any electron at any given moment. Instead, chemists use the term orbitals to describe the most likely location for an electron relative to its nucleus. And each orbital can hold up to 2 electrons. So the more electrons in an atom, the more orbitals they occupy. Electrons orbit the nucleus in shells, and we call them energy shells. And each energy shell represents a different energy level. So the lowest energy shell only has 1 orbital, which means it will have 2 electrons. But later, we can see that we can hold up to 8 electrons. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. But what I want you to understand now is that the number of orbitals in each shell determines how many electrons the shell can hold. Again, a little tricky, but there's a rule to kind of make this a little simpler. So electrons occupy energy shells according to the Octet Rule. The Octet Rule states that for atoms with atomic numbers of 20 or less, the following rules apply. The first energy shell can hold up to 2 electrons, meaning that's 1 orbital, and each additional shell can hold up to 8 electrons, 4 orbitals. So that 8 electrons, that's where the octet comes. So atoms are most stable and happy when they have 8 electrons on the outside. There's a couple of exceptions with hydrogen and helium, which only have 1 and 2 electrons respectively. But for most atoms, they want to have 8 electrons in their outermost shell. And each lower shell has to be filled before electrons can occupy the next shell. So we said the outermost electrons of an atom are very important. And these are called valence electrons. And the Octet Rule states that the outermost shell is most stable when it has 8 electrons, right? With the exception of hydrogen and helium. So what happens with unpaired valence electrons, so if there's not a complete shell, then electrons try to either bond with another electron, they try to steal an electron away, they can donate an electron, but all of these reactions, these are what chemical reactions are, involve just the exchange or the donation of electrons. Chemical reactions occur so there can be more stability. So unpaired valence electrons are not very happy. They try to interact with other atoms so they can have a full outer shell, because that's when they're most stable. And again, it's the difference between charcoal and gold, juice and olive oil, helium and air has everything to do with the electrons. That's what determines the chemical reactivity and the chemical properties of each element. Right? So the valence electrons determine the chemical properties of that atom. So these are some models of atoms where you can see this is the nucleus, and then we can draw each energy shell as a circle. So let's take carbon as an example. Carbon has 6 protons. So the first shell can hold, so how many electrons does it have? If it has 6 protons, that means it has 6 electrons. So in this first shell, we could have 2, 1, 2, but that's it. The first shell can only have 2 electrons. Every subsequent shell can have up to 8 electrons. So if carbon atom has 6 electrons, we'll put 1, 2, and then we have 4 remaining ones. 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, carbon has 4 valence electrons. Let's do the same with oxygen. Oxygen has 8 protons, which means it has 8 electrons. So the first shell will put 2 electrons again, And the outer one's going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So try to pause the video now and do this for phosphorus, which has an atomic number of 15. So pause now and make sure you can get this image on your own. Right? So now we're going to see what these valence electrons try to do in order to get the octet rule applied. They want to have a full outer shell. So oxygen is not going to be happy with 6 electrons on its outer shell. It wants 8. Right? Carbon wants to have 8. Nitrogen wants to have 8. Hydrogen wants to have 2. That was the exception with hydrogen and helium. So a molecule is multiple atoms bound together, right? So NaCl, sodium chloride, is a sodium and a chloride atom both attached to each other. O2, oxygen gas, is 2 oxygens attached to each other. If a molecule contains atoms of different elements, we call that a compound. So a molecule is just any group of atoms bonded together. If there are different atoms of different elements, we call that a compound. For example, one molecule of glucose is C6H12O6. That means in one molecule of glucose, there's 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. Since there's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right, there's 3 different types of elements, this is called a compound. So all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. For example, oxygen, O2, is a molecule because it's more than one atom bonded together, but it's only one element. It's only oxygen. It's pure oxygen, so it's not considered a compound. So water is a compound because it has hydrogen and oxygen. So a chemical formula can tell us the number of each kind of atom in a single molecule. So this is one molecule you'll be very familiar with. This is glucose, a monosaccharide. So C6H12O6 represents one molecule of glucose. So one molecule of glucose has 24 atoms in it. How many oxygen atoms are in each glucose molecule? So pause here. And the answer is C, 6. So bonds between atoms contain energy. And we'll talk about 4 kinds of bonds in this class. The first is called an ionic bond. We'll then talk about polar covalent bonds, then nonpolar covalent bonds, and finally hydrogen bonds. And again, the process of bonds forming or bonds breaking or bonds rearranging is a chemical reaction. Right? So a chemical reaction is just the rearrangement of bonds, which is essentially the rearrangement of electrons. Right? So chemical reactions just move electrons around, very simply put. So we'll talk about ionic bonding first. An ion is an atom that has either lost or gained an electron. What that means is it has a charge, either a minus charge or a plus charge. An ionic bond forms when electrons are transferred from one atom to another atom. So ionic bonds meaning the transfer of electrons. And a salt is a solid substance that separates into 2 separate ions when dissolved in water. So for example, table salt is NaCl. When you add salt into water, it's going to actually break apart into a sodium ion, which is positively charged, and a chloride ion, which is negatively charged. Right? So salts are solid at room temperature when it's not an aqueous solution as a solid, right? But once you dissolve it in water, then it breaks up into Na plus and Cl minus. And it turns out that chlorine and sodium have a very, very tight arrangement of their atoms, and that's what gives salt its crystalline structure. So let's talk about how this actually works. So if you recall, so I want you to look at the table, the periodic table now, and tell me how many electrons does sodium have? All right, so the atomic number is 11, which means it should have 11 electrons. So let's start drawing them. The first shell can have 2, 1, 2. I'll actually just draw on top of here. So we have 1, 2. Then how many could the next shell hold? 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 10 electrons. We have one more. Oh, okay. We have to draw a whole nother shell just for this one electron. Okay. Chlorine. What is the atomic number of chlorine? So it's 17. So again, let's do 2 in the first shell. Then we have 8. That gives us 10. So we have 7 more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have one vacancy here. So this should be, this should be telling you something. We said that atoms want to obey the octet rule. They want to have a stable outer shell. So chlorine needs 1 electron in order to fulfill that, and it'll be very stable. And sodium just has to lose 1 in order to be stable. So sodium tells chlorine, hey chlorine, I know you have a spot for my electron that I want to get rid of. Will you accept it? And chlorine is very happy to take it. And what happens is the electron goes over to chlorine. And since chlorine now has an extra negative charge, an extra electron, it's negatively charged. So this becomes an ion because it gained an electron. Since sodium lost an electron, it is also an ion, but now it's a positively charged ion. So after this transfer of electrons, we have a positive ion, sodium, and we have a negative ion, chlorine. What happens to positive and negative things? They attract. So what happens is the positively charged sodium and the negatively charged chlorine are almost locked in place. They have a very, very tight attraction to each other because of their opposite charges. But again, if you just dissolve that in water, they separate. Right? So this is an ionic bond, the transfer of an electron. So a covalent bond is a different kind of bond that results when 2 atoms share electrons. So each atom can have a full shell of valence electrons. So ionic bonds are transferring of electrons, where one atom gains, another loses. Covalent bonds are sharing electrons. And in a non-polar covalent bond, electrons are shared equally between atoms. So again, there's equal sharing of electrons. In a polar covalent bond, electrons are shared unequally. And we'll talk about this. This becomes very important. So we can draw individual atoms, let's say of hydrogen. Each hydrogen has 1 electron. But what can happen is these can come together and share their electrons. And now each hydrogen has a pair. This hydrogen has a full octet. Sorry, not really an octet. It has a full shell of 2 electrons. And this hydrogen has a full shell of electrons. And we can draw the sharing of a pair of electrons as a line. So when we draw like hydrogen and then like a line, this represents the sharing of a pair of electrons, right? Hydrogen originally had 1 electron. Another hydrogen had another electron. So now they're going to share these 2 electrons. So we can draw that as like a straight line. It's also possible to have a double bond. So oxygen had 2 vacancies in each of its outer shells, in its valence shells. So it's possible to share 2 pairs of electrons, and that's what a double bond is. So when you see O double bonds to O, that means each oxygen is sharing 2 pairs of electrons. Let's draw the example of methane, which is CH4. If you recall, carbon has 4 valence electrons. So we'll draw 1, 2, 3, 4. How many electrons does it want to have to be stable? It needs 4 more. So we could get 4 hydrogens. And what do we have? Carbon has a full octet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And each hydrogen has its 2 electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Methane is a very happy, stable molecule. And that's why it's so abundant. Right? So try to draw ammonia, NH3, on your own now. So this is a video that's included in the textbook, in the ebook. So when you're on Connect and you do the reading, I'd like you to review this video on ionic versus covalent bonding. So we said covalent bonds are sharing of electrons. In a polar covalent bond, electrons are shared unequally. An example of that is water. So this introduces us to a new topic that's really important: electronegativity. Electronegativity is the ability of an atom to attract electrons toward itself in a chemical bond. In other words, the electronegativity describes the greediness of an atom for electrons. What this means is some atoms really want to hold onto electrons more than others, right? Some atoms are really desperate for electrons more than others. So an atom that's very, very, very desperate for electrons is very electronegative. It really wants electrons. It's very greedy. So electronegativity measures an atom's ability to attract electrons. So if you have two different atoms with very different electronegativities, you might have an unequal pull of electrons. And we see that in water. In water, which is H2O, the oxygen atom, shown over here, is a lot more electronegative. So it pulls on the electrons a lot closer to it. The electrons are more drawn to oxygen than they are to the two hydrogens on the outside. That makes water a very polar molecule. Because the electrons are not shared equally, we say that it's polar. Polar means unequal. Right? So compare that to methane. Methane, CH4, all of the electrons are shared equally. Therefore, methane is a non-polar molecule. And this all has to do with electronegativity. If all of the atoms in a molecule has similar electronegativities, they could all happily share their electrons among the molecule. But if within a molecule you have different atoms of different electronegativities, you're going to have unequal sharing of electrons. So some parts of the molecule might be a little more negative, some parts might be a little more positive. So it's not an equal sharing in a polar molecule. So the periodic table arranges atoms by electronegativity, where it ranges from 1 to 4, where 4 is the most electronegative. So fluorine here is desperate for electrons, right? Chlorine really wants some electrons. Over here, like sodium, lithium, potassium, they don't care. They don't really need electrons at all. So we could use this electronegativity table to predict what kinds of bonds would be made between atoms. So in methane, we can see that carbon and hydrogen have very similar electronegativities. Therefore, neither will pull on the electrons much more strongly than the other. So in methane, you're going to have equal sharing of electrons, which means it is non-polar. Right? Methane is held together by non-polar covalent bonds because the bond forms when atoms have similar electronegativities. However, look at oxygen and water, such as in H2O. Right? Oxygen is a lot more electronegative than hydrogen. Therefore, oxygen will attract the electrons a lot more strongly than the hydrogen would. So that's going to make polar covalent bonds. The bonds between oxygen and hydrogen are polar because the electrons in that bond are more attracted to oxygen than they are to the hydrogen. So this is another way to show the unequal sharing of electrons, and it creates partial charges on the atoms. So again, we said oxygen is a lot more electronegative. So it's going to make the oxygen slightly negative. And we could use this little symbol, the partial negative symbol, to show that the oxygen is slightly negative. It's not negatively charged. It's not an ion, but it has a slight negative charge because the electrons, which are negative, spend a lot more time around the oxygen than they do around the hydrogen atoms. So the hydrogen atoms become more partially positive because they don't have as much of an attraction for those electrons. Right? So since electrons spend more time near the oxygen is more electronegative, the oxygen atom has a slightly negative charge. Since electrons spend less time near the hydrogen atoms have a slight positive charge. Water is thus a polar molecule because electrons are not shared equally. This is critical for water, and this is critical for all of life on Earth. Polarity is really a very important concept. The slight positive charge on the hydrogen atom of one water molecule, this is one water molecule over here. This is H2O. This is a hydrogen, this is an oxygen, and here's another hydrogen. So the slight positive charge on the hydrogen of one water molecule attracts the slight negative charge on the oxygen of a neighboring water molecule. This is called a hydrogen bond, and hydrogen bonds are drawn as dashed lines. It's a very weak attraction, but it forms between a partially positive atom and a partially negative atom. So hydrogen bonding is a very weak attraction between a partial positive atom and a partially negative atom. And these can happen within a molecule or between molecules. So for example, within a protein, you can have a lot of intramolecular, meaning within that one protein, there's lots of different hydrogen bonds being formed. But you can also have intermolecular interactions, which means multiple molecules are joined together by hydrogen bonds. So a single hydrogen bond is very weak. But when many come together, then it's very strong. So this is a very important illustration of different ways to look at water. So this is the space-filling model, which shows the partially negative oxygen and the two partially positive hydrogens. If you were to draw one water molecule, right, you would start with the oxygen. We know that it has two bonds, right? This is sharing of two electrons, and this is the sharing of two electrons here. And we know this because we can even take this a step back, and we know oxygen has 8 electrons, so it has 2 in its first shell, and it would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in its valence shell. Right, so oxygen has 6 valence electrons. Again, hydrogen has 1 valence electron. So here we go. Hydrogen is going to come there, and hydrogen is going to come right there. So whenever you see 2 electrons being shared between 2 atoms, that's that line. So that's how we can draw H2O. And of course, you can show that there are these extra electrons on top, but that's irrelevant for this class. So this is water. And of course, we know that since oxygen is more electronegative, it's going to have a partial negative charge because the electrons in this bond, right, the electrons in this covalent bond will spend a lot more time near the oxygen than the hydrogen, right? And that will make the hydrogens partially positive. So if I were to draw another water molecule, we can show a hydrogen bond. I'll change the pen color just to show. This would be the hydrogen bond. between the partially negative oxygen of one water molecule and the partially positive hydrogen of another water molecule. So that's what's being shown here. All right, all the dotted lines are between a partially positive hydrogen and a partially negative oxygen. So this is what allows water molecules to stick together. Right? So hydrogen bonding has everything to do with water's properties, and water's properties has everything to do with life, because without water we would not be here. So please watch the video on hydrogen bonding. So we could predict the types of bonds based on the electronegativities of two different elements. Two elements with very different electronegativities, like let's say sodium and chlorine, would likely form ionic bonds. Two elements with very similar electronegativities, like let's say carbon and hydrogen, will likely form nonpolar covalent bonds, sharing electrons equally. Two elements with moderately different electronegativities will form polar covalent bonds, like water and oxygen and hydrogen. You're not going to have to know the values of these. I'm not going to test you. I'm not going to give you a tricky question, but you should understand the concept of electronegativity and how electronegativity can predict the type of bond that two atoms would make. So pause here and try to answer this question. So the first part of the question asks what type of bond. So for that, we have to look at electronegativities. And we see that nitrogen and hydrogen have different electronegativities, but not drastically so. Right? So we could assume that they're going to make a covalent bond. Right? It's not like drastic enough to be ionic bonds. So we could say that it's definitely a covalent bond. And now let's draw nitrogen. So nitrogen has how many electrons? Has 7. So if I draw my nitrogen here, the first shell has 2 electrons. How many will the outer shell have? It will have 5. So how many hydrogens do you think this one nitrogen would attract? So again, we want to fill up the octet. And there we go. If we have 3 hydrogens, that would make a very stable ammonia. And that was the question I asked before. I asked you to draw that a few slides ago. So this is what you should have seen. So this is a summary table. Ionic bonds are considered the strongest, but they break easily in water, where hydrogen bonds are very, very weak. So water has many unique properties that are essential for life. Right? So life on Earth began in water, and for the first 3 billion years of life's history on Earth, all life was aquatic. It actually wasn't until about 500 million years ago when plants and fungi began to colonize land. And even now, right, nothing could live without water. So let's talk about the properties that allow water to be so conducive to life. One is that water has a high heat of vaporization. So that means that it takes a lot of heat in order to break those hydrogen bonds and water to evaporate. If we didn't have a high heat of vaporization, we would just evaporate, right? We are able to retain our water because of the hydrogen bonds are so strong. Many hydrogen bonds together keep the water together, so you would have to add a lot of heat in order to break the water apart. Evaporation comes into handy with sweating, right? So when sweat evaporates from skin, individual water molecules break away from the liquid droplets and float into the atmosphere. And the surface molecules must absorb energy to escape. So when they do, heat energy is removed, drawing heat out of the body. And that's what allows us to be cool. Right? So bodies of organisms cool off when their heat is used to evaporate water. Water has a very high specific heat. And what that means is that it takes a lot of energy to make water boil, which is another very important property of water. So why is that important? Right? So since we are mostly water, we want to be able to resist drastic changes in temperature. So water has a very high specific heat, meaning you have to really add a ton of heat in order for it to raise temperature, which is good, right? Because we don't want to just go outside in the heat and then start to boil and get our body temperatures up. So an organism may encounter considerable heat before its body temperature becomes very high, right? And likewise, the body cools very slowly in cold temperatures. Two important properties of water due to hydrogen bonding are called cohesion and adhesion. So both of these are very important. Cohesion is the tendency of two water molecules to stick together. And without cohesion, water would evaporate instantly from most locations on Earth's surfaces. Right? So cohesion is two of the same molecules sticking together. Adhesion is the tendency of water to form hydrogen bonds with other substances. So water likes to adhere to other polar substances. For example, if you take a paper towel and you put it on water, the water will adhere to it very tightly and it gets absorbed. Water gets drawn through the roots of a cell by cohesion and adhesion. So what happens is one molecule of water gets pulled up through the roots, and the water molecules adhere to these water conducting cells called xylem. So these cells are able to attract the water. So almost like Velcro in a way, almost like magnets. The water is drawn up because it's just like a paper towel or like a wick. The cells conduct water up by adhesion. And there's cohesion involved as well, because when one molecule of water is drawn up, it pulls on another water molecule beneath it. So between adhesion and cohesion, water can travel against the force of gravity in order to provide all these leaves with enough moisture. Water is a very good solvent, largely because of its polarity. So a polar substance dissolves very readily in water. We call this a hydrophilic molecule, right? If a substance dissolves in water, it is hydrophilic, right? Philic means loving, like philosophy is the love of knowledge. Hydro means water, so hydrophilic means water loving. So hydrophilic substances are either polar or charged, and that means that they dissolve readily in water. Hydrophobic molecules, on the other hand, do not dissolve in water, do not make hydrogen bonds with water. So, for example, hydrophilic things are like salts and sugars and soaps. They dissolve readily in water. They make hydrogen bonds, or they can break apart in water, like salt. Whereas hydrophobic substances are like oil, wax, and other fats that cannot dissolve in water. So water can help make solutions. So a solution contains dissolved substances called solutes in a solvent. So for example, a sugar solution is sugar dissolved in water. The solute is sugar. The solvent is water. So when you take a solute, you put it in a solvent, you get a solution. And again, if a solute is soluble, it will dissolve well. And why is that? Why does sugar dissolve well in water? Well, it's because it's polar, right? And it's hydrophilic. Right? So hydrophilic substances like salt dissolve in water. And what would happen on a close scale is the negative portions of the water would be attracted toward the positively charged sodium, and the partially positive hydrogens would be attracted to the negatively charged chlorine. So when you add salt to water, the sodium and the chlorine kind of dissociate. They separate. Why does ice float? And why does water expand when frozen? Well, it has a lot to do with these hydrogen bonds. So frozen water, which is ice, is less dense than liquid water. Because what happens is, at temperatures below 0 degrees Celsius, hydrogen bonds between water molecules become more rigid, and they expand. And when they expand, that means that they become less dense. They're less heavy because they're expanding. And that allows ice to float on water. And that's very important because if ice sank, then all aquatic organisms would be forced upward, right? The oceans would freeze from the bottom up. And that would not be good, right? We'd rather ice float. That explains also if you put a can of soda in the freezer, all the water molecules in that soda, as they get colder, the hydrogen bonds expand. They get farther and farther apart from each other. And that will actually break the aluminum can and it will explode. So in its pure state, water freezes at what temperature? 0 degrees Celsius. But by using salt, that freezing point can be lowered. So salt can prevent the water from freezing at 0 degrees Celsius because remember, what freezing does, it's making very rigid hydrogen bonds. So that's what makes it frozen. So by adding salt, you could break those hydrogen bonds, right? You could prevent the water from freezing because when you add the salt, suppose it's NaCl or calcium chloride, the ionic bonds between the salts are broken. And those ions will interrupt the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules and ice crystals. So that's why we add salt to our frozen roads, right? Because if we didn't add it, the water would freeze and form ice at cold temperatures. By adding salt, those ions are interrupting the hydrogen bonds in the ice crystals, thus turning them back into liquid water. Right? And that's what's shown here. So, pH is a measure of hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. So H+, what a hydrogen ion is a hydrogen atom that doesn't have an electron. Basically, whenever you see H+, that's just saying it's a proton. H+ is a proton. And this H+ is very, very important. It might look simple, but it is very important on living systems. If you have too much or too little H+, it could ruin the shape of biological molecules and render them non-functional. So there has to be the right amount of H+, of protons, in a solution. Pure water contains an equal number of, pure water is H2O, but H2O could be broken down into two ions. Right, H2O can be broken down into two ions. H+ is one, and OH- is the other. In pure water, normally, most of the water is intact. Most of the water molecules are H2O. But at any time, about 1 in a million water molecules spontaneously breaks into two pieces, where one becomes OH-, called the hydroxide ion, and one becomes H+. So it's about 1 in every million. So it's very rare. And acids are substances that increase the H+ concentration when dissociated in water. So an acid is a chemical that adds H+ to the solution, making the concentration of H+ exceed the concentration of OH-. All right, so when you have excess H+, that's going to become more acidic. A base is the opposite of an acid, right? A base releases hydroxide ions. So that will, again, shift. It will give you more OH- than H. Or a base can also absorb H+ ions. Right? It can soak up H+ ions. But either way, the result is the same. Right? The balance between the H+ and the OH- will shift toward the OH- with the base. Right? A basic substance is called an alkaline. So the pH scale is used to indicate how acidic or basic a solution is. And the range goes from 0 to 14, whereas 7 is in the middle, 7 is neutral. So pure water has a pH of 7. Water is neutral, meaning it has, if you really want it, it's the actual number, it's 1 times 10 to the negative 7 moles of H plus per liter, which is a measure of how many H plus ions there are. So that there's a reason why it's a value of 7, but we're not going to talk about that in too much detail. For now, know that if you are between 0 and 7, you are an acid. It is acidic. If it's between 7 and 14, then it is basic or alkaline. So if you have a pH of 5, is it an acid or a base? It's an acid. And the pH is used in a logarithmic scale. So it's a little tricky, but what this means is that each unit change in pH represents a 10-fold change in H plus concentration. What that means is something of pH 4 is 10 times more acidic than pH 5. pH 5 is 10 times more acidic than pH 6. How much more acidic is pH 4 than pH 6? Right? It's 100 times more acidic, right? So each unit on the pH scale represents a 10-fold change because it's logarithmic. That's what the P actually stands for. The P means the negative log base 10 of the concentration of H. Right? So pH of 4 is 10 times as acidic as pH 5. pH of 10 is 100 times more basic than a pH of 8. So just make sure that that makes sense. So here's a good diagram that shows the pH scale of some items that you're familiar with. So on the most acidic scale, you have all H pluses, right? All red over here. Hydrochloric acid, lemon juice, beer, vinegar, tomatoes, these are all very acidic. Where we have an equal number of H plus and OH minus, we have 7, pH 7, that's pure water, and tears. Human blood is slightly alkaline. And then we have like baking soda, it has more and more OH minuses. So sodium hydroxide is a very strong base. So pause here and try to answer this question. And the answer is A. So a buffer. A buffer is a substance that keeps pH within normal limits. So buffers are incredibly important to maintain homeostasis within organisms, right? A buffer can either accept an H plus or it can give an H plus away, right? So we need homeostasis in order for pH to not be too extreme. We don't want like any extreme imbalance in pH, or else that can be very threatening to the organism, right? So our body actually has a built-in buffer system to prevent pH changes in blood. So we have molecules in our blood that can accept H pluses if there's too much acid, if our blood is too acidic, or it can give away H pluses if it's too alkaline. So we need our blood to be between 7.35 and 7.45 at all times. And that's what our buffers do. They make sure that we don't hit acidosis or alkalosis. Right? So our buffers in our blood make sure that we don't have too extreme changes. It resists extreme changes. So pause here. Which of the following bonds is the weakest? The answer is C. If a mystery drink has a pH of 8.7, what is that? The answer is D, right? Both A and B are correct. True or false? And please correct the modified word to make the entire statement true. So what is this, true or false? Right? So this is true. This is a true statement. Is this a true statement? If two atoms had the same atomic number but different atomic masses, they would be called ions. Is this a true statement? No, this is actually false. So what word can you replace ions with to make it true? The answer is isotopes. Right? So that's the end of part 1. And next part, we'll talk about biomolecules.